Hello lovelies, I'm terrible at pimping my stuff, so here I am, pimping my stuff. Please like, subscribe, and most important of all, share, so that people can discover me and all the wonders that I offer. I've spent some time recently rereading Joseph Campbell's Hero of a Thousand Faces. This as a book is unavoidable, really, if you're a writer or even an RPG designer. The book has been very popular with a great many successful authors, a great many successful game designers, and has turned up in a lot of gaming books, as well as referenced in many regular books, genre books. It's lent a sort of intellectual veneer to a lot of what we do as writers and game designers. And if your heroes are constantly referencing something, if the people whose work you hold in regard are constantly referencing something, then you should probably take a look at it. So I reread it recently. And I kind of wish I hadn't. The first time I read it, I was pretty young still, and a lot of it, I think, sailed over my head or seemed very deep or full of gravitas, in part because I didn't really necessarily understand what I was reading. This time I found myself being a lot more critical of it, perhaps a reflection of how much more sure of myself I am in my writing. I knew most of the myths that were referenced in the book, so I could skim really, and get the gist of each section without having to delve into the examples, which made it a much faster read, but also undermined the gravitas and authority with which the assertions were made. In fact, the book reads a lot more like a religious apologia or a Jordan Peterson lecture, in that a lot of it is just nonsense and assertion with cherry-picked examples to pick it up. The foundations upon which the book rests are now, I would say, fairly unsound, as it rests upon Jungian analysis, archetypes, the shadow, etc. And psychology has come a long way, and not that that's saying much particularly, since the times of Jung and Freud. And as a result, I just don't think that's a sound basis upon which to proceed. At least not to build anything concrete or authoritative. The examples of myths that he gives throughout the book only tend to fit that one aspect of this monomyth that he's tried to construct, whereas those self-same myths contradict it in other places by putting things in different places in the story cycle and so on. There's a willful bending of archetypes to fit the point he's trying to make. For example, trickster gods exist in many cultures, but they differ quite significantly. Anansi is a mostly benevolent spider god. Loki is a rather mixed character. On the one hand malevolent, on the other extremely useful, using his talents to help the other gods. And then there's Eris, who only exists to cause chaos and could be called, perhaps, evil in a lot of ways. The trouble with Campbell, and the influence that he has had over writing, particularly Western writing, is that so many people have taken it as a way to write a story, that this is the model, that if you want to grab people, if you want to appeal to people, if you want to make a story work for the largest number of people, if you want to create a mythology even, this is the way you do it. You write to fit Campbell's monomyth. You write your adventures in tabletop games to fit the Campbellian monomyth, and perhaps the reason for that is this whole delving into the underworld section, which obviously maps at a superficial level onto dungeon delving, obviously. I don't think it's useful as that. I don't think it's useful as a guide, as a way to structure what you write. Stories have their own structures, and if we constantly try to go back to the same structure, things become rather stale and staid. Instead, I think it's most useful as a storehouse of tropes and archetypes to riff off, as a guide to all manner of different mythologies, stories that you might want to follow up on and read up on independently, but not useful as a prescription on how to write a story. Tropes and archetypes, and perhaps this is part of the reason that Campbell doesn't land the same way anymore, but the use of tropes and archetypes is now read as cliché, even if it isn't. People are so hyper-aware of existing story tropes and seeing them as cliché that they try to avoid them. Sometimes a story needs to fit a mythology, sometimes it needs to appeal to archetypes which are genuine but do change over time. And I think a lot of that underlies the problem that so many people have had with the newer Star Wars movies, because they're so acutely self-conscious, or at least the second movie in the trilogy is particularly, of tropes, of cliches, that it consciously tries to avoid them, and as a result ends up not being a Star Wars story, Star Wars being the exception that proves the rule of being something that really fits into that mythological milieu. So bucking that gives people something they don't want, hence the problem, I think. Or at least most people, it seems, don't want. More useful, I think, to people as a writer is to consider stories in the form of the Vonnegut story structure. And there's no better person to explain that than the man himself, though I have before. I think it's worth repeating.
Well, there's no reason why the simple shapes of stories can't be fed into computers. They are beautiful shapes. This is the GI axis, good fortune, ill fortune. Sickness and poverty down here, wealth and boisterous good health up there. Here's the very middle. Now, this is the BE axis. B stands for beginning. E stands for electricity. Now, this is an exercise in relativity, really, is the shape of the curves of what matters and not their origins. So we'll start a little above average, is why get a depressing person? We'll start... The whole thing, we call this story Man in Hole, but it needn't be about a man, and it needn't be about somebody getting into a hole. But it's just a good way to remember it. Somebody gets into trouble, gets out of it again. People love that story. They never get sick of it. All right, not copyrighted. Another story, also a beautiful curve and easily fed into a computer, called Boy Gets Girl, but it needn't be that. Just a way to remember it. Start on an average day, average person, not expecting anything to happen a day like any other. Find something wonderful, just loves it. Oh, God damn it. Got it back again. People like that. Now, these are beautiful curves, and this gets a little complicated. Computers can now play chess, so I don't know why they can't digest this very difficult curve I'm going to draw for you now. And it so happens that this is the most popular story in our civilization, Western civilization. As we love to hear this story, every time it's retold, somebody makes another $1 million. You're welcome to do it. Now, surprisingly enough, I've said it's depressing. You know, people don't like stories about below average days and people. But we're going to start way down here. Worse than that, who is so low? It's a little girl. What's happened? Her mother has died. Her father has remarried a vile-tempered, ugly woman with two nasty daughters, big daughters. You've heard it. See? Anyway, there's a party at the palace that night. She can't go. She has to help everybody else get ready. She has to stay home. Now, does she sink lower? No. She's a staunch little girl, and she has had the maximum whack from fate, which is the loss of her mother. She can't go any lower than that. Okay, so the fairy godmother comes. Gives her shoes, gives her stocking, gives her mascara. Gives her means of transportation. Goes to the party. Dances with the prince, has a swell time. Boring, 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 boring. Now, there's a slight inclination to that line as I've drawn it because it takes perhaps 20 seconds, 30 seconds for a grandfather clock to strike 12. Does she wind up at the same level? Of course not. She will remember that dance for the rest of her life. Now, she poops along on this level till the prince comes, the shoe fits. She achieves off-scale happiness.
Pulp Nova is a collection of short stories in the old pulp style but with a modern twist. You should find something here you like, from western to mythos horror to science fiction. You can get Pulp Nova at Drive-Thru Fiction, on Amazon, or in hard copy from lulu.com.